Hello everyone. Been following with interest the conversation that David at Zen Miniature Painting has been having about his research into the uniforms of the Russian army during the Crimean War, and he's following a path that a lot of us follow in general in our wargaming, of wanting to do his best to accurately portray the details and the coloration of the uniforms. As I say, I'm sure we all do it to one extent or another, and I certainly get almost paralysed by the sort of hesitation of finding conflicting sources, and even more than that, conflicting interpretations from different wargamers and so on, or even different artists. So Osprey books might differ from another reference source, all this kind of thing. So anyway, I wanted to take that conversation a little bit further and go off at a number of tangents, and begin with this book that I showed you quite recently. I picked it up in a charity shop and finished reading it about a week ago, and it's an absolute gem. I'm really glad that I found it. But of course I was reading it while David was uploading his videos on the separate subject, but I just felt there were a few parallels in this book that have a relevance to his conversation. So this book deals with, it's the account of Lieutenant Colonel H.B. Vaughan of the 7th Rajputs, his account of his participation in the relief column that marched from Tianjin to even from the Taku forts through Tianjin to Peking, and the relief of the legations there during the siege of the legation area in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 in China. It's called St. George and the Chinese Dragon. I thought it was simply that when I found it in the charity shop, and was happy to buy it just for that reason. But it's actually a lot more than that. For one thing, Lieutenant Colonel H.B. Vaughan was an absolutely remarkable character. I'm just going to show you a photograph of him, and just missed it there somewhere. There he is. So the archetypal Victorian, early Edwardian British officer, explorer, the moustache, everything about him just tells you about that period, doesn't it, really? He was actually, as I say, a remarkable character. The 7th Rajputs were, I don't think they were the first through the sluice gate into the legation area, but he was certainly the officer in command of the 7th Rajput contingent, which entered the British legation first of all. So I suppose it's one of those things, where different units of the different armies and so on will claim the prize in different ways, but technically he wasn't the first or the 7th Regiments weren't, I think it was a Sikh unit who got through the sluice gate first of all, but 7th Rajputs have the distinction of being the first troops that were invited into the legation area by Claude MacDonald, I think his name was, the British ambassador. Anyway, I'm getting off the point already. In previous adventures, Vaughan had actually travelled across Persia, made a couple of expeditions or journeys across Persia, an area at the end of the 19th century which was highly charged with Anglo-Russian competition. The British were very fearful of the Russian expansion into that area because it threatened their empire. It threatened India, and hence the wars in Afghanistan and so on. The Russians equally were trying to expand their southern borders, to expand their own empire, to reach the wealth and the resources of the Middle East and the Far East, and Persia was a prime kind of area where both powers were seeking to maintain an influence and so on. Lots of competition, lots of espionage and intelligence work, and the whole aspect of exploration crossed over and dovetailed into intelligence work. Now, so Vaughan has a number of medals and so on, and I think it was called the MacGregor Medal from the Geographical Society, the British, I think it's called the Royal Geographical Society, the British institution. But obviously his work was also of great interest to the British military. So his reports on the state of roads, the nature of the topography of the countryside, and suitable passes and so on and so forth. It was all highly detailed work that he did, which was of interest both to geographers but also to the military. And one of the key tools that Vaughan had in his armoury, as it were, was that he had trained when he was in the, I think in the militia, in his early adulthood. He was a trained artist. He had enrolled in I think it was called the Slade School in part of the University of London. But he was a trained artist. So when if you saw my previous video where I showed you this book, I referred to all these plates as being just that, plates that I had not come across. In fact, they are actually sketches and drawings by Vaughan himself, and that includes the front cover illustration. Now, that is really the first thing that I wanted to say about David's dilemma and the dilemma that we all encounter. This is a really useful source of, a primary source, you could call it, of detail on British uniforms and colonial uniforms, and the uniforms of some of the other contingents that were in that relief force. So that in this case, you have the Russians and the Japanese uniforms. Military sketches in this respect are very common for lots of periods. Sketching in its own right was something about the Victorian era in particular, especially pre-photography. Not that this is pre the camera, but right the way through the 19th century, you find there is a kind of an enthusiasm for sketching throughout the kind of British middle classes, both male and female gender, spent a lot of time and actually honed their sketching skills. It was all to do with the sort of philosophy of education and intellectualism in a way. Of the observation of nature. So you have the, prominent scientists like Darwin and so on have to train botanists. When you think of all the sort of botanical sketches that you can see in Kew Gardens nowadays, but the Victorians in particular were very keen to record the world around them and their particular subjects of interest in very precise detail through the medium of sketches. When it comes to the military, of course, it has that value that I was talking about earlier with regard to Vaughan's travels through Persia, that sketching the geography can give you far more information than a verbal account can do. So it has that additional informative effect that mere words don't do. So to be able to sketch a landscape accurately, especially prior to the camera, was a very valuable tool to have. So you will find that intelligence officers in particular, or scouting officers who are sort of practiced in scouting terrain and so on, will also be quite accomplished artists in their own right. In this respect, I don't think Vaughan, he probably didn't even have time to, as he was travelling on this relief column, which was a very arduous march indeed. He probably didn't have time to stop and sketch the landscape. But all these pictures, all these sketches look very much, especially the guy with a cigarette in his hand there, I think it's Royal Welsh Fusilier. They're obviously in a lot more relaxed state. But to cut my waffle short, what I'm trying to say is that this is a very handy resource that, especially in this case, where I've never seen these plates in any other history of the Boxer Rebellion. But just while I've got this book open, I thought I would read to you I've forgotten which page it is on now. Yeah, just going to pause the camera a second while I find the particular paragraph I want to read to you. Yeah, here we are. I just wanted to read this one paragraph to you, because these sketches do all look like what David described as sort of parade ground appearance of the troops. But listen to this. This is what Vaughan has to say about the interplay between different nationalities and how they swapped and traded various items of clothing. An interchange of accoutrements occasionally took place. Foreign officers would be seen wearing our puttees and British officers wearing American gaiters, but this occurred more extensively after our arrival in Peking, when kits and baggage had come up. Stowhasser gaiters, puttees and warm coats, British, were in great demand by the German officers, also our riding breeches, while American gauntlets, both fur-lined and unlined, were eagerly sought after by the Britisher, as was the American headgear for wear in quarters. If a committee on clothing had sat in Peking during the occupation, by taking one article of kit from one nation and another from another, they would have probably evolved the most perfect dress and equipment for a soldier that the world has yet seen, for each equipment had some good point in which it excelled the others. So in other words, the appearance that we try to achieve for our wargaming figures is obviously not the appearance that those troops might have had in the field, on campaign, in battle, and so on. You're really constrained to the detail that is on the figure or the sculpt that you have in front of you that you have to put paint on. So there's always that to take into account as well. Now that brings me on to the Crimea in particular, which we all are familiar with the hardships of the armies besieging Sevastopol, the poor supply, the scandals, particularly of the British army. The French army was very well organised and had a very good sort of quartermaster system, but the British lacked food, clothing, transport, all kinds of things, and there was a great scandal in the British press about it. So you can't expect really that the troops, British troops in particular in the Crimea, who not only had the rigours of the campaign to cope with, but they also had the inadequate supplies to deal with. You can't expect them to look like our model soldiers look like on the tabletop. But there is this other officer, the Earl of Cadogan, who very similar, well, not just similar to Vaughan, but similar to so many other Victorian era officers and gentlemen, had this sketching skill and sketching ability, and he was present right the way through the war in Crimea, participated in all the famous battles. He so he was a first-hand witness of the Crimean War in the Crimea. He produced masses of sketches, mainly of the Allied troops, obviously, because he had more contact with them. So he made sketches of personalities, he made sketches of uniforms and troop types, he made sketches of the landscape, he made little intimate sketches of various events. I mean, that's one that shows you a little bit more of the typical landscape of the Crimea, especially on the. This is a ford of the Chernaya River, so it just gives you an idea of the constraints that the geography placed on the troops on the sort of right side, the right flank of the troops besieging Sevastopol. So this is particularly the kind of terrain over which the Battle of Inkerman was fought, which, when you think as well, was fought in the fog, just gives you, an idea of how claustrophobic and difficult that battle must have been for the troops involved in it. But Cadogan did, as the war came to a conclusion, he did make quite a few sketches of the Russian army as well. See, these are unfinished sketches of the aftermath of sieges and so on. It must be towards the end of the book, surely. Here's a good example. So this is a kind of mix of officers talking and chatting. So you have a mix of Russian, French and British. So you've got the typical French Zouave there, but you've got some officers very immaculately turned out there. But you also have some examples of the Russian greatcoat here, which is exactly what David was talking about in terms of the nature of the collar and the collar, the shoulder straps and so on, and the coloration. I think you can probably say that Cadogan has used a slightly different colour here to the colour of the overcoat that the greatcoat that the Cossack is wearing there. But it does give you, just those extra little clues about. I mean, for instance, I'm painting up at the moment some Cossacks. They're Eureka 18 mil ones, and they are definitely portrayed with this greatcoat. So I'm not painting them this blue colour, which is what the Cossacks' tunics were mainly coloured in. I'm painting them in a sort of, my usual kind of browny sort of grey kind of colours. There's another one there, just noticed, that actually looks like it has a fur collar, which is interesting. I wonder if that is, presume that is a Russian officer. Certainly another Russian Cossack there. But it's just another thing to take into account, this whole Victorian, here's a good one, Victorian kind of preoccupation with sketching and recording. Sometimes what you'll find is that you have the Illustrated London News is a good example, pre-photography, but again even after photography, because the whole burden of carrying cameras around, getting film developed, photographs developed and so on, still made sketching a kind of competitive alternative to the art of photography for many years. But you will find that artists would sketch something very quickly and then go back to their studio or sit down in their tent after the event and develop the photograph. I mean, obviously, this crowd scene is not going to be done in an instant. So the figures that are portrayed in it are all going to have moved around and sort of intermingled and so on. But this interestingly is it's during the kind of period, the lull in the fighting at the end of the war, when the troops weren't allowed to kind of cross the Chennai River, but they did come down and shout kind of conversations across to one another. Just come down and there's even a guy there in a carriage looking through binoculars, just to get a good look at the enemy. So I'm looking there. This is really interesting, isn't it? Because this is the Russian side over here, and this is the Allied side over here, and there are some very colourfully dressed troop types there. No, they almost look Greek, but they sure they aren't, because that wasn't part of the. But maybe they are from somewhere in the Balkans, controlled by the Russians. I don't know. Interesting little details, for instance, like the coloration of the carriage there. It's sort of like a yellow ochre sort of colour, not a colour that you associate with the Russian army as much as with the Austrian. And then unfortunately he didn't finish the colouring in the that side of the whole thing. But you can get lost in looking at these kind of things. Another example that I wanted to just sort of talk to you briefly about was to do with the Anglo-Zulu War. So, the 1879-1880 period, well into the period of photography, but sketches still had an important role to play. So this is a sketch obviously done, it's based on a sketch that was taken at the time by an officer called Krelock, who, if any of you have seen the film Zulu Dawn, Krelock was played by the actor Michael Jaston, and in the film he's often sat down making sketches. He did sketch an awful lot during the campaign. Wasn't present at Rorke's Drift, but was on Chelmsford's staff, so obviously witnessed the relief of Rorke's Drift when the column that had separated off went back to Rorke's Drift after the battle, the defeat of Isandlwana. But this has been, sort of tidied up and elaborated in the studio afterwards. But there were other officers. I mean, look at these. This one here, this sketch, is also a view of a sketch of Rorke's Drift from the perspective of the relief column. This is a sketch of one of the wagons in the barricade to show, show the appearance of the barricades. But you can get you can get ideas of, or quite strong clues about how the wagons were coloured. They have a sort of tawny red wheels, sort of light blue woodwork on the on the timber of the wagons. It's really valuable first-hand reference material. Now this isn't Krelock. This is another officer. I've forgotten his name, but it does tell you. Two sketches by Lieutenant Colonel Henry J. Degacher of the 2nd 24th of the Defence of Rorke's Drift. Degacher commanded the 2nd Battalion in Zululand and was present with Chelmsford's force, which returned to the post on the morning of the 23rd. So this wasn't taken for the purposes of intelligence, but look how close. I think this is called the Siani River, mountain rather. Look how close and how accurate he got it to a photograph that the author, Ian Knight, took in around the 1980s of the same perspective and viewpoint. You can see how something like that, a sketch of that taken in the sort of back of beyond, in the sort of Central Asia, would be of great value to military intelligence, just in terms of knowing suitable routes to march armies through and so on. But anyway, as wargamers, we are always striving to have accurate representations on our tabletop, but we immediately have to make compromises. You have to make compromises with, as I say before, you're restrained by what the figure actually presents you with as to how you paint it. You can do massive amounts of research into appropriate colours, but it may not be an accurate representation in the first place. But also, when it comes to scenery, to terrain, and so on, you immediately find you have two choices really. One is to, if you're talking about, now I'm going back to the Boxer Rebellion here, because at the moment I'm revisiting the Boxer Rebellion. Well, I never really left it, but I just to pick up these things and carry on projects very slowly and spasmodically. But currently I'm thinking about that game that I was talking about in a video a long time ago, that I saw at Salute. I think it was in 1985. Yeah, 1985. Always had great fondness and recollection for that game. It was put on by the Staines Wargamers, and always thought if I got back into, or if I ever got into the Boxer Rebellion, I would want to reproduce that game in some way. So I've been thinking about terrain and how to model the legation buildings on the table, and I realised immediately that it's impossible to have an accurate depiction of the buildings. You can do something that looks like them, but you can't accurately reproduce them on the tabletop, and that's because the footprint of the buildings is going to take up a massive table space. So unless you're playing with a 1-to-1 scale ratio for your figures to actual human beings on the table, the buildings are, you've got a choice of either shrinking the buildings down so that they are sort of occupying the appropriate footprint, so that if you're wargaming in 28mm, you get a more accurate representation by putting 15mm buildings down on the table. But that never looks right to me. I always want the buildings to be the same kind of proportion and scale as the figures I'm playing with. So your only alternative then is to trim the map, as it were, trim the footprint, just put the relevant, or the prominent buildings down. So here you have a map of the game as they set it up. The British legation is here, and it's really only got two buildings in it. A main building there and a side building there, and it's also got the famous arch that led into the legation with a redoubt outside, which was known as Fort Halliday. So it's got the prominent, the salient points to it, but it looks nothing like the actual legation building did. Now I did find, I have shown you this magazine article again, quite a few years ago now, but I just recently I've discovered that there was another article in Wargames Illustrated, and it's actually got some colour photos of the game, which I was delighted to find. And I was sure in the back of my mind that I had seen colour photos of this building somewhere, and I was right, here they are. But this is like 4 years later. The game was so popular that they revived it and took it around the show circuit again. But you can see that the buildings are just, it's artistic license. They admit it themselves. They had extended the table slightly by this point and put in the Italian and Austrian legations as well. So it's a larger table, but all the same, they have gone for, there's some more pictures in the back inside cover here of the game. They have gone for a very kind of generic and even, interpretive version of what they think the buildings might have looked like. You can be pretty confident, well, we know from photographs that it looked nothing like this at all. And there's another article here. Also I've got a map. So this is in a book called The Siege at Peking by Peter Fleming. This is a map showing you the actual, a more accurate layout of the legation quarters. But this is particularly, it doesn't actually say where they got this illustration from. It looks a lot like something you might find in the Illustrated London News. But this is in a magazine called Practical Wargamer, autumn 1988. It's nothing to do with, although it's the same time as that those Staines Wargamers tour of their game, it's nothing to do with that. It's just an article on the Boxer Rebellion, but it's a very useful depiction. If it is the Illustrated London News, it reinforces my argument earlier on about how those sketches and so on, dating from the time, are a very useful resource that we can all use. But it shows the whole, just the British legation alone and what it looked like, and you can see how crowded it was with buildings and amenities and so on. It was actually the principal and best situated kind of legation for the whole of the legation quarter. It had the only drinking water for the whole legation quarter, for instance. So it was the sort of it was to have been the fallback defensive position if the other legations were overrun or mined. But yeah, it's just give you a kind of quick idea about the actual appearance, if you wanted to model it, of the actual British legation. I mean, that building there in particular, I won't go searching for it now, but there are lots of photographs of that taken after the siege was over, and all these arches on both of the floors are sandbagged up and so on to turn the whole place into a redoubt in its own right. But what I'm trying to say at this point is that no matter how much research we do, how accurate we do actually try to present our figures and the terrain, at the end of the day you're going to have to make many compromises in order to be able to wargame, in order to be able to put your figures on the table, move them around, actually play a playable game with them. We're not making dioramas. We're not trying to put something on the table that is a picture perfect representation of a battle. We're trying to create games out of that history, and you're never going to be accurate. Even if you try your hardest, you're never going to get. So I'm fine with this. If I eventually do get to play a game, with my table is going to be very. It's going to be closer to this than it was to the actual reality. Let's put it that way. Anyway, I think I've gone on long enough. Really enjoying David's kind of ongoing conversations about his research into the Russian army, and look forward to watching his progress in future videos. Thanks for watching anyway. Bye for now.